Well, if we go by the UN numbers, and I think your audience should understand that a migrant, an international migrant, is someone who has left their country of birth. They've been outside of their country of birth for a year or more. And according to the UN numbers, we're looking at close to almost 300 million people who live outside of the country in which they were born. Now, that sounds like a lot of people, but it's barely 3.5% of the global population. And if you look at those numbers, we got to boil it down to those who have left their country because they couldn't stay there.
And you call that forced migration. And,
forced migration.
We have a graph here that shows that.
Yeah, this is forced migration. And the UN counts people of concern who have had to leave where they were living for one reason or another. And that's about 110 million people today, so about 1% of the global population. And it's also important to note of those people of concern, refugees are actually only about 25 million. Asylum seekers are around 5 million of those numbers. And over half of those people are people who are displaced for one reason or another, who've been forced to move. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to survive.
So when you think about what's happened in the last few years, I mean, Ukraine must be an example.
Yeah.
Yemen,
Yeah.
Syria.
Yeah. Well, until the Ukrainian crisis and the Venezuelan movement, about 86% of the people of concern were somewhere in the global south. So most of those people had not been able to move towards the global north. So the overwhelming numbers, they're trapped in areas that are conflict areas, areas where climate change is forcing people to move in the global south, in Africa, the Middle East, also in Latin America, Central America in particular. I would say that today we're looking at a humanitarian crisis, the likes of which we have not seen for in our lifetime.
David, how do you see this?
Well, look, if you look at the U.S. population growth over time, we're at the lowest rates in our entire history, right? Down over 90% from its highs. And the consequence of that is we have a lot of older people who are in their retirement years, drawing on Social Security in most cases. And that population difference ultimately means that there are fewer workers supporting more retirees, which increases inflation and also means that there aren't enough people paying into the system. So the Social Security Administration estimates that by about 2034, you're going to have a 30 million person or worker shortage that they need to keep revenues equal to expenses. And because of that shortage, they'll have to massively either increase taxes or cut benefits to Social Security. So absolutely, we need workers. It's unfortunate the reasons why so many people are on the move. That's not a positive thing. I look at the decline in liberty around the world as really a disastrous thing for the world. But there is an opportunity for the United States to take that negative and turn it into a positive thing for the country.
David, you've done some interesting work at Cato looking at how what's happened as far as freedom and economic freedom have affected migration. Take us a little bit into that study.
Yeah, so since 2007, about 90% of the world's population has seen a decline in freedom as measured by the Cato Institute, Fraser and Center's analysis of the measure of human liberty. And, this measures all freedom of speech, freedom of association, all freedom of trade, all of these different measures of human liberty have been on the decline. And if you look at where migrants are moving, the majority of them have moved from a country with less freedom into a country that's more freedom. And sometimes it's a sort of a marginal shift, but sometimes, the marginal shift can be huge. So for people moving out of Syria into Turkey, Turkey isn't the freest country in the world, but it's a lot better than living under the despotism that we saw under Assad. So that is a big motivating factor for a lot of the migration we have seen. People want to get out of disastrous situations run by tyrannical governments around the world.